today, there is a panoply of movements that would begin to question gender on the basis that it has been part of a system of control and oppression invented by humans. The gender critical movement, as well as the transgender movement, both criticize gender on the grounds that it's basically arbitrary and used to create power relationships, such as the supremacy and dominance of the male over the female. They argue that gender is socially constructed, and since it's a social construct with what they see to be quite negative effects on society, they argue that it should be deconstructed, and they go about this in various ways. The gender critical movement argues that gender roles should be abolished entirely, while transgender people engage in various actions designed to render gender obsolete as a means of dividing people, which is what I have elsewhere termed gender accelerationism. Transgender people, by mixing qualities of both genders or by disowning the gender they were quote-unquote assigned at birth, are supposedly showing its arbitrary nature and thus defeating it as a truth paradigm through which we see males and females. They even go as far as to question biological sex itself. But all of this skepticism is based on a false notion about the origin of gender. Anyone who wants to create a historiography of gender would have difficulty figuring out exactly when or where in history gender was invented. As far as we can tell, every society from the hunter-gatherer up to modern industrial societies has gender roles, and a great deal of time in evolutionary psychology has been spent trying to suss out the probable evolutionary pathway for gender norms. The real question, then, is what is behind the genesis of gender? What has caused humans to self-divide into man and woman with distinct roles and behaviors? In this video, I'm going to argue that the origin of gender roles is not arbitrary, but rather, it is a biosocial extension of evolutionary selection pressure and mating dynamics. The first claim that gender-critical people make is that gender is completely arbitrary. The position of most people today is that gender simply describes the natural differences in behavior between men and women. Women are typically passive, men are typically active. Women are more emotional, while men are more rational. Women are more delicate, while men are more tough. The differences and expectations that we have as a society for both men and women are contingent on these observed differences. Gender-critical people turn this position on its head and instead argue that the reason why women are more passive, more docile, or more delicate has more to do with socialization than pre-existing natural differences. The problem with this view, however, is it ignores that behavior has biological origins, not just social ones. In fact, we could very much argue to the contrary that the origin of sociology is biology, because fundamentally, everything we humans do is generated by the brain, and the brain has been subject to evolutionary pressure since the very beginning. Despite the existence of some countervailing evidence, studies have discovered sexual dimorphism, or polymorphism if you will, in the brain. DeCassian et al. 2022 performed a review of the existing data and concluded that the reason for the existence of studies that find no significant differences in brain morphology is mainly due to methodological differences which, once controlled for, reveal that there is actually very solid evidence for sexual dimorphism in the brain. In the first place, there is significant evidence in the literature that males and females differ in terms of cognitive behavior. From Liu 2020. Biological sex robustly modifies risk for diverse human brain disorders, with some conditions occurring more frequently in males, e.g. autism spectrum disorder, and others more commonly in females, e.g. major depressive disorder. Humans also show consistent sex biases in several cognitive behavioral domains, including aggression, risk-taking, mental rotation, and face processing, both emotional valence and identity. These sex biases and disease risk and behavior emerge with stereotyped developmental timing and are highly consistent across different settings, suggesting a potential contribution from patterned sex differences in brain organization. Consequently, characterization of sex differences in human brain organization provides a critical context for understanding how biological sex might contribute to variation in disease risks and behavior. Now for the actual data on brain dimorphism. In Williams et al. 2021, it was found that men have higher total brain volume than women, even after controlling for differences in body size. According to the study, sex differences occurred in 67% of cerebral measures on a large population. Liu et al. 2020 found that differences that have been found, and which are non-controversial in mice, are translatable to human research. The consistency, causes, and consequences of sex differences in the human brain are poorly characterized and hotly debated. In contrast, recent studies in mice, a major model organism for studying neurobiological sex differences, have established 1. highly consistent sex biases in regional gray matter volume, GMV, involving the cortex and classical subcortical foci, to a preponderance of regional gray matter volume sex differences in brain circuits for social and reproductive behavior, and 3, a spatial coupling between regional gray matter volume sex biases and brain expression of sex chromosome genes in adulthood. First, using 2 independent structural neuroimaging datasets, number over 2000, we find that the spatial map of sex biased gray matter volume in humans is highly reproducible. Relative gray matter volume is female biased in prefrontal and superior parietal cortices, and male biased in ventral, occipitotemporal, and distributed subcortical regions. Second, through systematic comparison with functional neuroimaging meta-analyses, we establish a statistically significant concentration of human gray matter volume, sex differences within brain regions that subserve face processing. Finally, by imaging transcriptomic analyses, we show that gray matter volume sex differences in human adulthood are specifically and significantly coupled to regional expression of sex chromosome versus autosomal genes and enriched for distinct cell type signatures. Further, in Lotsa 2019, they found in a large sample of 2,838 that males and females differ in gray matter volume in several different areas of the brain. Most interestingly is that males have higher gray matter volume in areas associated with visual spatial processing and motor skills, which aligns well with what is demonstrated in tests of spatial reasoning, where males have a decisive advantage, a subject I have covered in a previous video. More gray matter volume in women than in men was prominent in medial and lateral prefrontal areas, the superior temporal sulcus, the posterior insula, and the orbitofrontal cortex. In contrast, more gray matter volume in men than in women was detected in subcortical temporal structures such as the amygdala, hippocampus, temporal pole, fusiform gyrus, visual primary cortex, and motor areas, premotor cortex, putamen, anterior cerebellum. Now let's return to DeCassian et al. 2022. He first goes through some of the prior knowledge that we have about sexual differentiation. He notes that Darwin's theory of sexual selection through mate competition applies also to humans, then goes on to explain how sex hormones alter brain structure. 1950 study, Phoenix CH et al. Showed the effects of hormones on brain structure in guinea pigs. Recent studies have verified this fact in rodents in general, such as McCarthy MM et al. 2012, Morris IA et al. 2004, and Wallon K 2005. And Corey C et al. 2016, and Woosden DA et al. 2018, they found brain differences in rodents through fMRI scans. There are, in addition, non-experimental studies that show similar effects of hormonal secretion in humans, like Liao Z et al. 2021, Dubal M 2021, Method DP 2003, and Kranz GS 2020. Further, even sex chromosomes are directly linked to changes in brain morphology. There is extensive evidence in both rodents and humans that sex chromosome dosage can influence brain organization. The 4-core genotype FCG model in mice provides experimental evidence that XX and XY groups show several reproducible neuroanatomical differences in fMRI, as well as differences in vasopressin fiber density within the lateral septum. Evidence for sex chromosome dosage effects on human brain comes from observational research in groups with differing X and or Y chromosome dosages due to sex chromosome aneuploidy. Specifically, increasing X and or Y chromosome dosage induces highly reproducible changes in diverse aspects of regional brain anatomy, including parietal occipital cortical surface area increased, lateral temporal cortical thickness decreased, and the volume of the cerebellum and globus pallidus both decreased. Then the study explains why there is a great deal of evidence for brain dimorphism on an epidemiological basis. First, multiple neurodevelopmental disorders with onset in early childhood are more prevalent in males than females, including autism spectrum disorder, ASD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and early onset obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. In contrast, there is a sharp rise in female-biased risk for depression, anxiety, and eating disorders in adolescents, and of certain neurodegenerative, e.g. Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and psychiatric disorders, e.g. late-onset schizophrenia later in life. The concentrated emergence of sex-biased disorders in windows of particularly dynamic human brain development, i.e. early childhood, adolescent, and postmenopausal years, suggests that sex differences in neurobiology contribute to the emergence of these conditions. Sex biases in socio-cultural norms and the applicability of diagnostic criteria are likely to contribute to some of the observed sex biases and disease rates. For example, reduced help-seeking behavior in men may explain their lower treatment rates for depression, and current diagnostic guidelines lead clinicians to underdetect ASD in females. However, such biases cannot explain multiple diagnostically distinct disorders all showing the same sex bias during the same developmental window, e.g., male-biased early onset ASD, ADHD, and OCD. Second, sex-biased psychiatric disorders display biological features that interact with known sex differences in neurobiology. For example, the profile of altered gene expression from postmortem brain studies in ASD is partly correlated with normative sex differences in brain gene expression. Similarly, the adolescent emergent female bias and anxiety is closely linked to measures of pubertal progression that track activation of the hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis in females. Third, medical disorders that modify sex-linked biological factors, e.g. sex chromosome dosage, are associated with increased risk for sex-biased brain disorders. Fourth, males and females exhibit differences in their presentation and progression of multiple neurological conditions. For example, 1, females with ASD exhibit more camouflaging behavior, i.e. compensating for and masking autistic characteristics, and a higher rate of co-occurring internalizing disorders that may mask autistic symptoms, and these factors contribute to the underdiagnosis of ASD in females. 2, mania is more prevalent among males with bipolar disorder, while depression and comorbid panic disorders, eating disorders, and borderline personality disorder are more prevalent among females with bipolar disorder. And 3, males with schizophrenia tend to exhibit higher rates of substance abuse and lower rates of recovery and remission. These differences suggest that sex-based biological and experiential factors may interact with disease-related factors to impact condition progression. Finally, sex differences in treatment responsiveness continue to emerge. The mechanisms underlying these differences include sex effects on drug metabolism, e.g. in Parkinson's and schizophrenia treatments, and specific sex genotype interactions that affect treatment response, i.e. APOE genotype X sex effects on Alzheimer's treatment outcomes. Taken together, these diverse sex differences among multiple brain-based disorders provide compelling indirect evidence for sex differences in human brain organization. DeCassian then explains that the reason why reviews like the one by Elliott and colleagues that claim to have found no significant sex differences in the brain is because they did not account for methodological considerations in their review. There are issues such as correcting for body size, the nonlinear scaling of parts of the brain, and of course there's also the obvious issue of sample sizes. Elliott took none of this into account, which is why that study is so contrary to the information we do have on brain sex differences. The overlapping regional brain differences in brain volume across 3 independent samples and high statistical precision with which Williams and colleagues were able to detect regional anatomical sex differences in the full 40K UKB sample suggest that methodological factors may have led Elliott and colleagues' literature review to underestimate the consistency of sex differences and regional brain autonomy. This hypothesis is supported by the observations that 1, individual reports collated by Elliott and colleagues varied greatly in their sample sizes and techniques for anatomical analysis, and 2, results of these studies were tallied without adequate adjustment of these study design features. The problem posed by this heterogeneity is well illustrated by considering Elliott and colleagues' results tally for the amygdala, a region that consistently demonstrates significant male bias volume in the left of both hemispheres across multiple recent large-scale studies, as well as in the study by Williams and colleagues. Figure 2a shows the individual studies of the amygdala volume that were tallied by Elliott and colleagues, plotted as a function of date, sample size, and technique for brain size control, with the study by Williams and colleagues included for reference. This plot highlights the gross heterogeneity across these study properties, the sharp recent rise in sample size yielding studies with similar findings, and the order of magnitude increase in sample size represented by Williams and colleagues' recent study. We also provide a sample size weighted entry for the results of Williams and colleagues. The sample size and methodology informed retallying of the studies reviewed by Elliott and colleagues reveals a strong signal from past literature for mean amygdala volume being larger in males than females after accounting for brain volume using unbiased methods, which is precisely the result reported by direct MRI data analysis in multiple recent large studies, including Williams et al. Now, I think these studies pretty well establish that there are sex differences in the brain, and what this practically means is that the differences in male and female behavior, the differences that we typically attribute to gender, are somewhat innate. This should be pretty obvious if you think about the way gender manifests around the world. No matter if you're in Russia, Japan, Europe, the United States, or South America, gender norms are almost exactly the same, with men being primary, women remaining secondary, women wearing dainty clothes such as dresses or skirts, a demure attitude being expected of women, and so on. These social fixtures of gender essentially make emphatic what is already true about women behaviorally. Now, there's another study that might shed a little bit of light on exactly how sex and sex differences evolved. The study is called Gamete Signaling Underlies the Evolution of Mating Types and Their Number, and it is about single-celled organisms and the modes of their reproduction. It is noted that mating types, which are the microorganism equivalent of sex, evolved from differences in signaling and detection of gametes, gametes being the two reproductive cells, which in humans are the sperm and the egg, for example. This, by the way, proves that sex is binary because sex evolved from gametes and there are only two gametes, which is true for evolutionary fitness reasons, as the paper argues. Two gametes can better signal to each other than three or four. Now, we know that mate signaling is important in humans as well, and as the study argues, this signaling is crucial for reproductive success, and it is what's behind it. The ability to send and detect sexual signals directly influences the ability of cells to reproduce. In humans, this tendency for signaling to increase reproductive behavior is true as well. We might caution that we cannot extrapolate the behavior of multicellular organisms from unicellular ones, which is to some extent true. But the point of bringing up this study is that it reminded me of the basic fact that sexual signaling dynamics exist for other organisms. The reason why we have gender is because there is an evolutionary need to signal and detect sexual selection signals. A well-known example of this is the peacock, which displays a colorful array of feathers to attract mates. Human gender is the social equivalent of the peacock's feathers. It is a mating signal designed to communicate fitness for reproduction. As such, the existence of gender is not an arbitrary construction, but rather it has evolved in lockstep with the human brain as part of a complicated evolutionary signaling chain. So far from a system of oppression designed to maintain the dominance of patriarchy, it is simply a logical outgrowth of biosocial necessities. Other evidence for a biosocial origin of gender roles comes from the field of evolutionary psychology. This field is heavily debated by leftists, and I have made 2 response videos on the subject that you can check out if you want my response to that debate. But the basic point is that evolutionary psychology does produce testable hypotheses that are falsifiable, so as a field, it is certainly valid. One study, Sex and Care, the evolutionary psychological explanation for sex differences in formal care occupations, summarizes the relevant points. Men tend to be more things-oriented than women because they, due to having advantages in cardinal navigation, physical capacity, and spatial reasoning, tended to go out hunting. Women, on the other hand, since they stayed in the home range gathering due to their increased vulnerability and possibility of pregnancy, tended to be more social or people-oriented. This predisposes them to different roles in society, where their relative strengths can be a benefit and where their relative weaknesses can be compensated for. In addition to these evolutionary behaviors causing differences in roles, it has also resulted in differential sexual selection. Women tend to seek males with high status because males were valued for their ability to gather resources, while women were valued for fertility markers such as youth or beauty, which signifies health. This basic difference, the paper argues, is behind the stratification of men and women into different professions, such as men being more often physicians, which is a status-oriented field, while women tend to be nurses or social workers, which are people-oriented fields. In this way, the origin of gender roles is certainly out of evolutionary selection dynamics and natural differences between males and females. This, of course, has implications for sexual signaling dynamics, where low-status males tend to lose competition for women, while high-status males tend to more readily accumulate mating opportunities. Now, this is the part where I start editorializing. We wonder why birth rates are declining in the West when there are groups of people actively trying to disrupt this carefully tuned signal machine, trying to make normal heterosexual reproduction unfashionable, and trying to amalgamate males and females as much as possible. Not everything exists for the sake of oppression. We can prove that nations do not exist purely to exploit people or to exclusivize resources, but rather we know they evolved out of kinship dynamics and evolved in-group preferences. We can also prove that gender is not a system of oppression, but rather a biosocial system of expression and mate sorting. At what point do these people admit that their whole game of reducing everything down to sociological constructs is simply a sign of their own scientific illiteracy or anti-scientific hostility? And for people like the TERFs or the gender-critical people who agree with all this skepticism of gender but who think that believing a person can change their biological sex is too far, since it's a denial of reality, don't you understand that the very thing you're critical of is also downstream from biological reality? There's no hard disconnection between biology and society. There's no hard distinction between sex and gender. Society is just genes expressed in an environment. Gender is genes expressed as a social category. Every hierarchy or classification of people we have had in history has some sort of relationship to biological differences, whether that be intelligence, race, sex, or gender. None of it is whatsoever disconnected from biological reality, which is why I call it biosocial. It's what Ryan Falk called the genetic mesh, genes influencing culture and culture influencing genes. There is a reason, after all, why the disconnection between the concept of gender and sex is very recent. Historically, people tended to think of sex and gender as synonymous. If your worldview doesn't have a holistic picture of exactly what a human is and why we make categories, it isn't going to be able to make useful or true observations about reality. Maybe we can continue this experiment of demolishing gender, but I'm confident that it'll have disastrous consequences for sexual selection, birth rates, and the cohesion of society, as well as our ability to sort out our differences and get along. If our differences are just arbitrary, then there's someone to blame for differences. If sex differences are caused by oppression, then women will go to war with men because of their differences, seeking to eliminate any possible divergence that they have from men. Instead of sexual peace, we will have sexual war. Since these differences, because they are biosocial in origin, will never go away, the war will never come to an end. I don't think you want to let that genie out of the bottle. I certainly don't. There's certainly a lot of invective against oppression, but what these gender-critical people don't realize is that they're essentially oppressing natural differences. They are pathologizing people for exhibiting perfectly natural biosocial behavior, like gender, and insisting that it's harmful to them or a kind of internalized false consciousness. Likewise, the reasoning behind all of the policies that actually oppress, say, whites, like affirmative action, mass migration, or reparations, is foundational on an oppression of natural race differences through the egalitarian lens. To switch gears back to sex, in natural conditions, men will naturally dominate over women. They have biological advantages in certain mental abilities, they have advantages in competitive social environments, and they have advantages in raw physical strength. To create a situation where men do not dominate would require the oppression of men and not of women. It only goes one way. The people who endlessly bleat about oppression seem to be engaging in a sort of projection where they argue that their specific vision of power relationships should be enforced in society to the exclusion of natural hierarchies which were invented by no one. If the problem is that nature is oppressive, then it's absurd and quixotic to declare that we should completely be free from nature. It's a bit like going to war against windmills. We are not free from genes, we are not free from selection pressures, we cannot be free from the natural vicissitudes of living in a competitive world with scarce resources. In short, we cannot create paradise on Earth, and peace between all the heterogeneous elements of the world must, in the end, mean world domination, not liberation. The basic fact of the matter is that conflict is the underside of this so-called diversity. You can say all you want that you want to get rid of the impediments to individual expression, but what you're actually doing is removing the collective identities that allow people to group together peacefully. You can remove hierarchies, but what you're actually doing is removing a sorting mechanism that puts different qualities into their respective places so that they can unite rather than clash. This postmodern, hyper-individualist worldview denotes such a high degree of human fragmentation that it approaches quantum indeterminacy, the random bouncing of particles off of each other, the inability to hold anything into a given place at any time. It destroys stability. It destroys civilization. It does not liberate, but rather it creates anarchy in the pejorative sense of that term, where all is at war against all. We need a way to sort out differences that can be reconciled and negotiated. In what way can two individuals closed up inside of themselves be reconciled? How can two wholes, or non-copossible monads, as Lyotard puts it, that belong to themselves, even be brought into a sphere of mutual cooperation and peace? What from below appears like a system of restriction and oppression actually shows itself from above to be the only thing that can possibly hold together a mosaical society. To understand this, we might look at the traditional world. With difference manifested in the ancient world, it always took on the form of an empire. It was understood that the free exchange of values, culture, ideals, and ways of life had a naturally destabilizing influence that would undermine the host nation. So emperors took to task dividing up the empire and sorting its regions and peoples into hierarchies. This ensured that the empire could remain stable despite the need to integrate heterogeneous elements. What happens when these hierarchies and regional nationalisms break down is precisely what occurred during the fall of the Roman Empire. Barbarians escaped their enclosure and began decimating Roman cities. It became a war of all against all. The basic fact of the matter is that if you want to have a truly diverse society, you have to accept restriction of the parts so that they can be properly integrated into the whole. Amalgamation breeds violence, and people will naturally resist it since they see it as a threat to their existential well-being. What you're looking at when you see conservatives defending gender roles isn't an attempt to cling on to a reactionary power structure, but rather they're trying to preserve the natural diversity and peace that has evolved since the beginning of humanity. It is not a matter of economic or political interest, but rather a purely existential reaction to a force that seeks to wipe out all natural differences. Rome wanted to stay Roman despite presiding over an empire, but the barbarians coveted Rome. It was in the interest of people who wanted to destroy the Roman way of life to carry out a conflict with their others, and essentially what this gender-critical movement constitutes is an attempt to destroy the way of life of a great majority of the population who are comfortable with gender roles. They don't want to let traditional men and women have a seat at the postmodern table of identities. They want to eradicate man and woman. They want the violence of amalgamation. They don't want to make peace with reality. They want to change it, like in a permanent revolution. We can see then that dominance hierarchies, far from being oppression, are not only natural, but also a source of harmony and peace. It is the gender-critical people whose position is to do violence to harmonious norms. We have endured almost a century of feminism, and women have been becoming steadily more unhappy. As NBER states, by many objective measures, the lives of women in the United States have improved over the past 35 years, and yet we show the measures of subjective well-being indicate that women's happiness has declined both absolutely and relative to men. The paradox of women's declining relative well-being is found across various data sets, measures of subjective well-being, and is pervasive across demographic groups and industrialized countries. Relative declines in female happiness have eroded the gender gap in happiness, which women in the 1970s generally reported higher subjective well-being than did men. These declines have continued, and a new gender gap is emerging, one with higher subjective well-being for men. Now that women must compete in the highly competitive workforce with men as their supposed equals, they have realized that this new, more complicated mode of life makes them very unhappy in comparison to the simplicity and freedom of being a homemaker. When they broke down happiness domains in Stevenson and Wolfer's 2009, they found that women are more likely to be satisfied with their jobs than they are about having new experiences, having good relationships with friends or loved ones, or having fun. We can see how entering the workforce directly sabotages all these domains, as women now have less time to devote to seeking new experiences, less time to socialize with family members and friends, as well as less time for recreation. Gender equality, as well as the coming eradication of gender, does not seem to have properly interfaced with the actual way women experience the world. It's almost as if it is deeply unnatural and contrary to female biology. Now that women must compete to be men, they are realizing that they do not enjoy it, that it doesn't speak to the very core of their being. And what we actually find in countries that have achieved higher degrees of gender equality is that women naturally choose to be more feminine. In countries like Norway or Sweden, as reported in the documentary Brainwash, despite greater gender equality, women embrace gender roles more readily than in countries like Iran, where women often do not have the luxury of being homemakers due to the poor economic conditions. And of course, no one would say that Islam is any less bullish about gender norms than Christianity. The only response the gender critical movement has to this fact that women, when given the choice, actively choose the feminine gender role is to accuse women of having false consciousness. But what this accusation essentially is the denial of female agency, which is truly a kind of sexism. If women cannot possibly discern what's good for them, then why should we ever respect their decisions? Isn't that a kind of patronizing attitude? Of course, the feminist brigade blames it on men, as they do with everything. It's the fault of internalized patriarchy or something like that, and only feminists and gender-critical people know the real truth about gender roles. The possibility that gender roles are an expression of what women biologically are is completely ignored. Apparently, the ordinary knowledge of an actual woman about her own feelings, identity, autonomy, and desires is not enough. Individual autonomy is all well and good until it doesn't give you the political result that you want. We've already learned this lesson under liberalism with its quote-unquote paradox of intolerance. And likewise in Marxism, the working class doesn't know what it truly wants. It must be told by, ironically, bourgeois experts what should be in its true interest, and anything else is false consciousness. Again, human agency and freedom is everything until it's inconvenient. You are only liberated once you are controlled.